Okay, so for a third video on the module on spatial considerations in sports tourism development, we'll talk about sports tourism landscapes. Now, there are many ways that we can interpret sports landscapes. So the first interpretation is sport landscape as natural habitat. So it is possible for sport participants to encounter and utilize natural landscapes for certain sports events, and when the events are over, never return to them. They remain landscapes and never become sportscapes. Landscapes therefore may be used for sports but never sportized. In any permanent sense, impressions of nature and environment are important in the elements of the athlete's experience. So for instance, you do mountain climbing, and after you leave that place, you know that mountain remains to be a mountain and not as a sports area or as a sportscape, but just remains to be a landscape as it is. Next, we have sport landscape as a human habitat. The sport landscape may also be regarded as part of human habitat. Conscious decisions can be made for slopes, soils, elevation sites, and routes, channels of or relief features to be used as homes for sports. Humans rearrange nature into sports-related forms, an adjustment rather than conquest of nature, so that we make landscapes so that they will be habitable for humans, for them to be able to perform their sport. Next, we have sport landscape as an artifact. So many sport landscapes disregard the natural and semi-natural landscape upon which they are found. These views sees mankind as the conqueror of nature, with concrete, plastic, and glass, totally flat synthetic surfaces, and indoor arenas in which nature has been neutralized. So these are specific to sports that are done indoors, that are done in stadiums, that are done human-made, human-made establishments and infrastructures. Next, we have sport landscape as a system. Sport landscapes can also be viewed as a part of an intricate economic or physical system. A sports stadium, for example, does not exist in isolation. It generates flow of people and spatial interactions over an area much greater than the stadium itself. For example, the Tour de France is part of an extensive economic system that affects the places through which it passes. Sport events are also part of physical systems. Snow conditions influence performance in ski races, and rain may deter attendance in sport events. So we look at sport landscapes not as, individual areas in a specific given space, but they're connected to larger systems that are social, economic, and physical in nature. And these things interact with each other in order for us to adjust to, or make considerable changes for the sport that we are doing. Another way to interpret sports landscape is that it is a potential or an actual problem. The excessive dominance of sport over nature may be seen to lead to social and environmental pollution, erosion, and visual blight. Problem landscapes occur in a variety of sports in quite different ways. Traffic congestion and crowding can result from hosting a sports events in an inner city stadium. For example, yung mga very crowded nating mga cities and municipalities in the Philippines, erosion of soil and damage to plant cover on ski and alpine regions are also examples. Impacts also differ in terms of their performance. Next, we can also consider sports landscapes as wealth. The sport landscape may also reflect the view that land is a raw material. The long-term returns of lands given over a sport are important. So too are the significant economic benefits that one-off events generate in local areas. So again, sports landscapes can be thought of as something that could generate wealth to people. Of course, when you go back to our very first discussion in tourism, we understand about economic benefits. Next, we have sport landscape as an ideology. The sport landscape may be viewed as a reflection of various ideologies. Sport landscapes may be explicit responses to nationalism. New national sports may be introduced to countries from more dominant neighbors. The stadium may be an expression of modern technocentric ideology. So, for example, in this picture, this one, this cauldron is a representation of, the fiery passion that we give in sport. But of course, the whole building also represents, Philippine ingenuity in terms of architecture, because it's a national artist for architecture ang gumawa nito. Although of course we have a lot of issues in relation to corruption, and that will also be attached, to this specific area in, for eternity, I think. Next, we have sports landscape as history. So the present-day landscape of sport is a result of cumulative processes of historical evolution. Sport landscapes are often accumulation. Size, shape, materials, decorations, and other manifestations tell us something about the way people have experienced sport over time. And of course, looking at how sports landscapes are digitalized, automatized, are also a part of the historic development of the sports. Next, we also understand abstractly that sports landscapes are places. The view sees landscapes as a locality possessing particular nuances, unique flavors, and a sense of place. For the sports participant, athlete, or spectator, the experience of place, therefore, could be argued to contribute to the overall sporting experiences. And we could connect this with our discussion in the previous video on, of course, the intersection between, the sport, the place where it's held, and the culture of the sport and the place. And finally, we have sports landscapes as aesthetics. So landscapes can possess aesthetic qualities, predisposing the observer towards one against another. Aesthetics are related to the artistic quality of the sports landscape. The aesthetics of sport landscape are also portrayed in paint, film, photograph, and print. Such portrayals may be accurate presentations of what exists in the physical landscape. It is also possible that landscape icons may become mythical landscapes as well. So again, going back to aesthetics, we could also go back to this, the cauldron, and why it is an important item in the whole SEA Games experience, because of course it adds to the beauty of everything. Now, in this next discussion, we're going to be talking about the difference, and the similarities of how we manage tourism industry resources and sports sector resources. And in this way, when we talk about sports tourism and we talk about, a committee developing sports landscapes, and you talk about a committee talking about, tourism development, they can already, put their heads together so that they won't be duplicating each other's works. So for natural features in tourism industry resource requirements, we have national parks, scenery, of course, lakes, mountains, rivers, coastlines, which are of course very specific to cultural and leisure tourism. And of course, for sports sector, we have the same thing. We also have national parks, open amenity spaces, of course, where we can do transportable sports. We have wilderness areas and geographic features, which are also for adventure tourism and adventure sports tourism. And we also have mountains, rocks, spas, coastlines, and marine environment. So if the tourism committee and the sports committee put their heads together, they don't have to duplicate each other's works. Next, for facilities and infrastructures, of course, dito sila medyo magkakaiba. The focus of the tourism industry is on the sector. So we have the transport services, accommodation, dining, entertainment, and hospitality industry. But for sports sector, syempre, it has to be related to infrastructures related to sports. So we have stadia, arenas, sports halls. But also we include transport infrastructure because we have to move athletes and spectators from one place to another. So yun yung pwede nilang i-contribute together with the tourism industry or the committee. And of course, they also have dining and entertainment, na pwede naman din nilang i-contribute or i-collaborate with the tourism committee. Next, we have built amenities. So, syempre, kailangan in any tourism spot, there should be public toilets, parking, facilities, signposts, shelters. And this is also the same for sports sector resources. So, again, when we looking at, mega events, these are something that, sports committees and tourism committees should be talking about so they don't duplicate efforts. Next, for tourism information services, What are the services needed? So we have the visitor information services, internet-based information services, booking, ticket service, travel agents, tour operators, etc., etc. And of course, different ang need naman ng sports sector. We have coaching, leadership, equipment, apparatus, storage and management, safety, training facilities, injury, prevention and medical facilities, and science and research facilities. So, dito pwede silang, they can work together, but complement each other kasi wala naman silang naduduplicate na trabaho because of course the requirements for the services of sports sectors in relation to the athletes would be different definitely to the tourism industry. So they could connect so that they can complement yung kawalan ng isa't isa. Next, for tourism organizations, they do planning and development, strategic planning, destination imaging, tourism marketing, place promotion, visiting media programs, industry coordination and liaison, which is of course not, nag-iba lang yung pangalan, but that's also what sports management does, diba? You have groups, who look for fundings, sponsorship, they also do information services, they do marketing and merchandising, they also do, I think sports organization also do planning and development, strategic planning. So these are, again, things, when we do large-scale sporting events, tourism organizations and sport organizations can put their heads together so that they don't duplicate the effort. And of course, tourism industry and sports sector have the same transport services need. Although of course, in relation to sports sector, the transportation is not really high priority. Unlike of course, when you talk about leisure tourism, mas gusto nila yung mga medyo fancy na mga transportation because the transportation itself is the attraction. So like the gondolas, heritage rail tourism, hot air balloons, because these are of course part of the attraction. But for sports tourism, hindi naman siya talaga part ng attraction unless i-request of course ng mga parties that are involved. So ang kailangan lang talaga is getting them to the sports location where they could do their sports or they could watch the sport. And of course, for entertainment, we have attractions, casinos, cinemas, zoos, shopping, nightlife, and nightclubs for the general leisure tourism industry. But also, the tourism industry can help in expanding their available entertainment activities and attractions by, including sport halls, venues, like ice rinks, leisure centers, gymnasiums, swimming pools, climbing walls, golf courses for golf tourism, marinas, sports museums, Hall of Fame, and shopping nightlife, which is also could be part of the itinerary of sports tourists, both athletes and spectators. Now, we were explaining in the first video that one of those that influences distance decay is the transportability or reproducibility of sports. Now, there are sports that we can consider to be transportable or reproducible, meaning they could be done anywhere there's a space that we can work with. So, example of this would be indoor sports, like for example, basketball. Diba? It's a transportable sport. You can do it in different arenas. All you need is to have the apparatus, right? And you can do it anywhere. It could be outdoor, it could be indoor. Another example would be ice skating. Ice skating, an example of a transportable sport. It used to be done outside, when the lakes and the rivers are frozen, they do the ice skating there. But they can already transport them indoors so that people can also do ice skating indoors and can also do ice skating even if there's no winter in the country. And then of course we have temporary and permanent sports location. So for example, ang temporary sports location, for example, hiniram natin yung isang convention center sa SM at doon ginawa yung table tennis competition. And after noon, tapos na. Hindi na table tennis competition yun. So that's an example of a temporary transportable sport. Pag pinasabi na natin yung permanent na transportable sport would be, for example, yung sa Clark, nandun na yung aquatic center. Nandun na siya. Hindi na siya pwedeng bawiin. Nandun na siya forever. So that's an example of permanent. So for permanent, the issue here is the issues on displacement, yung mga people and organizations that will be displaced in order to produce a specific sport location. And of course, we have non-reproducible sports. Like, hindi kung saan-saan ka lang pwedeng pumunta para gawin yung sports na yon. There's a specific, specific landscape that has to be achieved in order for you to have that sport. So example, skiing, mountain climbing, surfing. Hindi mo pwedeng, surfing mostly is non-reproducible. Of course, later on we will learn na hindi naman siya like purely non-reproducible. But generally, it's non-reproducible. So in short, green sports, those done in nature are usually non-reproducible. Kasi pag in-indoor mo sila, the whole quality of the sport experience is decreased. Now, since we're talking about sports landscapes are also related to the environment. And of course, just like general tourism, sports tourism also has a general impact on the environment, even if the mega sport event happened for a short period of time. So what would be the short-term impacts of sports tourism or events? We have travel, traffic congestion, crowding, and of course we experienced this, in the recent SEA Games, maraming na detour, maraming mga flights na delay, right? Because of that, maraming schools na hindi naman marami, pero there are some schools like the LSU, like Saints Co, that canceled classes because there are a lot of sports events that are happening within the area. So that's an example of short-term impacts. And of course, vandalism that can be done by the sports tourist spectators. We have antisocial behavior, littering, madaming nagtatapon kung saan-saan, and breaches of security are also part of environmental impacts of sports tourism. Now, let's talk about sports tourism in the built environment, meaning these are man-made environments, not natural landscapes that are found in urban areas. What are the types? So the first one, we have the active sports tourism in a technologized sports landscape, like for example, hotels, urban parks, gymnasiums, and pools. Where you can do your sporting activities, but they are part of a larger technologized, industrialized establishment. Next, we can also have recreational club sport, dedicated sports fields of improvised settings. Like for example, extreme skateboarding, yung gawa-gawa lang makeshift lang natin yung mga trick areas nila. And of course, street basketball. Where just do makeshift hoops for people to play basketball outdoors. Another would be recreational or competitive sports that take place in natural environments in the urban fringe. For example, would be kayaking for waterways. And then, of course, like we have the man-made surfing waves, surfing pools like this one. But of course, elite surfers would say that this is not as exciting as they would do it outside, in the actual beach, because the waves here are predictable. They want a little bit of unpredictability. And of course, another built environment that puts this all together are event sports tourism, such as regional sports events, international sports events, championship meets, and of course, Olympics. So, the scale of the event, of the sports event, the larger the scale, the more problem and issues it brings. So, for mega events, such as the SEA Games, the regional games, Olympics, what are the issues that can be found? First one, of course, we have displacements. So we explained that earlier. For example, sa Clark, maraming mga indigenous peoples na na-displaced para ma-build yung mga areas na yon. We have increased rates and rent in the areas where it will be done. So yung accommodations, tumataas yung kanilang presyo. Disruption of daily routine. So ayun nga, maraming trabaho ang na-disrupt sa traffic. There are some schools that have to close, to suspend their classes, and some security issues because there are a lot of tourists coming in. But of course, this comes with increased economic and tourism activity that brings economic benefits to the country. Siyempre, the more modest events, like for example, single event championships lang, kahit international, or yung mga palarong pangbansa lang, mas less yung negative impact because this won't be experienced in a large scale. Now, when we turn landscapes to sportscapes, what are some of the issues? So, one is homogenization and standardization of sport, and of course dahil dyan nawawalan na ng local flavor yung ibang mga sports that we're doing, and probably you have learned this in sociology of sport. And then of course the erosion of the cultural mosaic that encourages tourism. So dahil nga, for example, kung pupunta ka sa isang lugar na basketball stadium or basketball arena or football arena, yun din naman ang itsura ng football arena sa lugar ninyo. So bakit ka pa pupunta sa ibang lugar para lang makita ng football arena? And the reason why ganun din ang itsura niya, it's because of homologization and standardization. So it is a challenge, for those planning sports tourism. How can we be able to make our stadium culturally attractive but still follow the international standards of these sportscapes? Now, in planning events and planning the spaces, we have to also talk about compatibility of sports in a mega event. For example, Olympics or regional games such as the SEA Games. Because, of course, for example, in the Philippines, there are limited spaces in relation to where we can do our sports. So there are 3 ways we can put sports together. So there are sports that are compatible, partially compatible, and incompatible. So compatible sports are sports that can use the same area of land or water at the same time. So for example, as you can see in the picture, yung mga some gymnastic sports can be done tawag dito at the same time, in the same gymnastic stadium. For example, in Rizal Memorial, I was able to watch gymnastics, and there were especially during the qualifying rounds, diba? Pwedeng sabay-sabay na merong nag-high bar, nag-uneven bar, nag-vault, nag-floor, nagre-rings, especially during qualifiers, Yung tawag doon compatible, And we have also partially compatible sports that can use the same area of land or water but at the same time. For example, yung MOA Arena, pwede siyang maging basketball court, pwede rin siyang maging volleyball court, but you cannot watch them at the same time or apply them at the same time. Usually one at a time lang. Pero yung same land area, yung same space, pwede mong gawin for both, for more than one sport. And then we have incompatible sports that cannot use the same area of land or water and need to be zoned into exclusive spaces. Like for example, skiing, jet skiing, kayaking, dragon boating. Hindi pwedeng may kasabay na nagsiswimming habang nagda-dragon boating. Or hindi rin siya yung tubig kung saan ginagawa yung dragon boating, hindi rin siya parang viable for a swimming competition to happen, kasi nga hindi siya standardized. So yun yung incompatible sports. For us to ascertain incompatibility or compatibility of the sports, we have to check yung extent of conflicts that sports have with each other. So we have symmetric conflict, which describes situation in which participants in 2 sports feel the existence of social conflict arising from the presence of the other. So let's say surfing and jet skiing. Definitely, the jet skier and the surfer wouldn't feel happy na nakikita nila they're sharing the space ng isa't isa. But when we say asymmetric conflict, this is when participants in one sport are adversely impacted by the presence of those engaging in the second sport, while participants in the latter is not faced by the presence of those engaged in the former. So for example, the same space, may nagbabasketball and then may nagbabadminton, and then madalas yung nagbabasketball, apektado yung mga nagbabadminton kasi lagi silang natatamaan ng bola, nahagisan sila ng bola. Same thing siguro with volleyball, Pero yung mga nagbabasketball, hindi naman sila masyado apektado nung nagbabadminton sa gilid nila kasi wala naman silang possible na magagawang disruption doon sa basketball game, So that's example of asymmetric conflict. So a few words, in relation to how do we maintain the environment in its nicest possible way while we are developing sports landscapes in order to improve sports tourism. So development must conform to the natural and cultural landscape and other regional features. In the long run, this will be crucial in preserving and enhancing qualities that are already assets to tourism. That for the local people, it will be the most important to construct the arenas and other buildings needed for the event in an environmentally friendly way. diba? Sustainable tourism and sustainable sports tourism. Development of the sport resource base at a destination does not in itself represent opportunities in the field of sport tourism. Rather, it must be coordinated with the development of the tourism sector at a destination. So that's yung sinasabi natin, no? We always have to think that the development of sports landscapes, sports stadium, arena, whatever, can generally affect the community. And one of the areas where development of sports areas could affect is tourism. And therefore, it has to be collaborated with the tourism organizations to ensure that adequate transport networks, accommodation, and tourist and information services exist to allow sports tourism development at the destination to meet its full potential. So in this video, we were able to learn about tourism, sports tourism landscapes, the different interpretation of a sports tourism landscape. We also talked about environmental impacts of events. We also talked about sports landscapes in the human-built environment. We also talked about compatibility and the reproducibility of sports.